They say history is written by the victors. But tonight, I'm taking you somewhere no history book days to go. Somewhere hidden in the smoke of candlelit rooms, behind the laughter of the elite, lies a story so twisted, so grotesque, that the walls themselves seemed to shiver when it happened. This is not fiction. This is a wound in time that refuses to heal. In the year 1859, in the heart of a wealthy southern estate, a man of power, privilege, and arrogance made a bet, a wager over something as trivial as pride, but the cost would be anything but trivial. He bet against fate itself, against a world he thought he could control. The stakes: a slave, a woman bound not only by chains but by the relentless machinery of oppression, a woman whose body and labor had long been claimed, but whose spirit remained a dangerous, unpredictable force. The man lost. He didn't just lose money. He lost control. And the penalty, as cruel and perverse as the society that made it possible, was marriage. Not a simple ceremony, not a union of love, but a binding of power, a legal cage for both master and slave, performed before witnesses who smirked at the spectacle. They all laughed, thinking it a joke, an absurdity to entertain their shallow amusement. But the woman had been waiting. She had known this day would come. She had lived in the shadows of the kitchen, beneath the weight of scorn and oppression, learning every secret corridor of the estate, every structural weakness of those who considered themselves untouchable. And when the night of the wedding arrived, she stepped into the room with a patience born of centuries of containment. No one could foresee what followed. The night began with candlelight and music, as if the world itself had been invited to witness a grotesque parody of marriage. But darkness has its own momentum. It gathers, unseen, and then strikes with precision. By the end of the evening, 7 people lay dead. 7 people. All because one man underestimated a woman he thought powerless. And the truth behind their deaths, the truth behind the rage and cunning that had been brewing beneath the surface, it would shake the foundations of everything they believed about power, control, and the illusions of superiority. Tonight, I'm going to show you not just what happened, but why it mattered, and how the forces that allowed such horrors are still shaping the world you think you understand. If you think you are ready to descend, brace yourself. This is the first door. Step through it, and there is no turning back. Power is never as simple as it seems. It is a living, breathing force that flows beneath the surface of every society, every estate, every household. And in 1859, it flowed in ways most people will never recognize, because those in control deliberately keep it invisible. That night, the wedding was not just a punishment. It was a demonstration, a twisted display of dominance masquerading as celebration. The master believed he was asserting authority. But the truth is, authority is fragile. It is a reflection, not of your strength, but of the fear you can impose. Every guest in that room, men in finely pressed suits, women adorned in silk and lace, were actors in a theater of power. They were conditioned to watch, to laugh, to affirm hierarchy without ever questioning its cruelty. And yet, even among them, a subtle tension lingered, a premonition they could not name. It was the awareness of a force lurking where they had assumed none could exist. The woman, the supposed victim, moved with a calm no one understood. Calm, yes, but beneath it, an intelligence honed by years of observation, by every injustice endured, by every humiliation stored like fuel for a fire that would not be denied. She had been invisible for so long, a ghost in the mansion, a figure the elite assumed harmless. But invisibility is a weapon. It allows you to see what others cannot, to study patterns, weaknesses, and the illusions people cling to as reality. By the time the first candle flickered and shadows stretched along the walls, she had already positioned herself in the web of influence, touching every weak point, testing every reaction. Every laugh, every boast, every sneer was a thread she would later pull to devastating effect. This is the lesson most never learn. Power underestimates the powerless at its own peril. History is littered with moments when the assumed weak struck with precision because they were not weak at all. They were unseen, underestimated, and patient. And patience is the most dangerous form of control. It is not brute force. It is strategy, intelligence, and the ability to wait until the moment is perfect for the collapse to occur. By the end of that night, the so-called master would learn a truth that would haunt anyone who assumes dominance is ever absolute. Fear, cunning, and the human will are forces that contain tables faster than brute strength. And what happened next was no accident. It was inevitability, the natural consequence of underestimating what you cannot comprehend, of thinking control is ever permanent. The wedding night began like a performance, carefully choreographed to reinforce who was in power. The music swelled, glasses clinked, and laughter echoed through the grand hall. Every step was a calculated display, every smile a mask. But beneath the polished veneer, something darker was awakening. The woman, the slave who had been reduced to an object in everyone's eyes, walked among them with a presence that demanded attention without a word. She was watching, noting, calculating. Every gesture, every angle of light, every breath in the room became part of her invisible map of opportunity. No one realized how meticulous she had become. Years of servitude had given her an intimate knowledge of this house, the hidden passages behind walls, the brittle floorboards beneath the dancers, the flammable drapery that no one thought twice about. She moved like a shadow among them, but her mind was a weapon sharper than any blade, sharper than any knife that had been stashed in the kitchen for emergencies. And she was patient. Patience is a tool the powerful rarely master. They act impulsively, convinced the world bends to their whim. She waited for the moment when chaos could be precise, when the environment itself could be an ally. Then it began. Small things first. A stumble, a misplaced candle, the subtle creak of a floorboard beneath the wrong foot. The guests laughed nervously, thinking it accident. The master, drunk with arrogance, felt his ego swell, believing his authority unshakable. But beneath the laughter, tension coiled like a serpent ready to strike. Her eyes, calm and calculating, watched every reaction. Every gasp, every flicker of fear, was fuel. And she did not hesitate. By the hour's peak, the room had transformed. The subtle disturbances she had orchestrated multiplied, cascading into confusion. Panic whispered through the guests, a shadow crawling along their spines. And then the first screams broke the illusion. One by one, the fragile hierarchy began to crumble. They realized, too late, that the woman they had treated as powerless was not only present, she controlled the environment. She had weaponized every detail they ignored, every assumption they made, every underestimation they embraced. That night, 7 people died. But the deaths were not random. They were precise, calculated, perfectly aligned with the lessons of power, fear, and retribution. And the master, the man who had thought himself untouchable, realized with horror that the laws of domination could be rewritten by those he had deemed invisible. This was more than a tragedy. It was a revelation. It was a warning that the powerful, when blinded by pride, can fall faster than they ever imagined. And the truths hidden in that room, they are still relevant today, if you dare to see them. What happened that night was not mere chaos. It was precision in motion. It was the execution of a mind that understood the invisible architecture of fate. Most people never stop to consider how power is maintained, not through wealth, not through titles, but through control of perception. The guests believed they were safe because they understood the rules. They believed the master was untouchable because society had reinforced it for generations. They believed that a slave, a woman they had mocked for years, could never alter their world. That belief was her weapon. Every action she took was designed to bend perception. The creaking floorboard, the flaring candle, the whispered panic in corners. It was all subtle, almost invisible. But humans are fragile creatures, easily nudged into terror when their expectations collapse. Fear, when orchestrated, becomes as sharp as a blade. And she wielded it with surgical accuracy. Each guest's reaction fed the next, like dominoes set to fall by their own instincts. She didn't need to touch them. She merely created a stage where their own bodies betrayed them. And the master, he felt invincible until the first scream tore through the hall. The sound was more than panic. It was the shattering of his assumed control. That sound rewired his perception, cracked the confidence he had always worn like armor. He had believed in hierarchy, in laws, in the illusion of his superiority. But the moment fear entered the room, the illusions dissolved. The same rules that had kept society obedient no longer applied. And the woman, who had been ignored for so long, now held absolute influence over the environment, over life and death. This is the core lesson most men never understand. Real power is invisible. It does not announce itself. It whispers. It waits. And when you underestimate the unseen, it moves like a predator you never noticed until the jaws are upon you. That night was not an accident. It was the culmination of years of suppressed observation, of psychological mastery born from oppression. Every insult, every scorn, every dismissal was fuel stored for the precise moment when it could explode. And this is where the story becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror. Look closely at the structures around you, the systems you trust, the hierarchies you obey, the people you assume are powerless. The forces you overlook, the shadows you ignore, may already be shaping events you think are secure. That night in 1859 is a warning. Dominance is an illusion. Control is fragile. And the unseen will always have its hour. The morning after was a silence heavier than any scream. The mansion, once a place of laughter and power, now reeked of terror and disbelief. Those who survived wandered like ghosts, haunted by the memory of screams and the sudden, incomprehensible collapse of hierarchy. They had witnessed something their society was not prepared to acknowledge. The powerless, when underestimated, could wield influence that shattered even the most rigid structures. And for the master, that night had rewritten reality entirely. He had thought wealth and social standing made him untouchable, but he discovered that fear, cunning, and patience were forces far stronger than gold. Historians rarely record nights like this. The truth is inconvenient, uncomfortable, and dangerous. Accounts were deliberately buried, rewritten, or ignored. The story of the woman who orchestrated 7 deaths in a single night became whispered rumor, erased from polite society. The lesson embedded in her actions, that invisibility can be power, that patience can be weaponized, that perception shapes reality, was deliberately obscured. Power, after all, cannot survive in a world where the powerless are understood to be dangerous. And so, society chose silence. But the aftermath was more than social. The psychological imprint remained, not just for the master or the guests, but for the very institution that allowed such cruelty. Fear had entered the system, not as an external threat, but as an internal realization. Control is fragile, hierarchy is an illusion, and every assumption can be exploited. Those who believed themselves safe and privileged now felt a subtle tremor in their understanding of reality. And those who were supposed to be powerless began to see cracks in the walls of their containment. This is the hidden truth that most people never grasp. Events like this are not isolated anomalies. They are lessons in systemic fragility, in the consequences of underestimating human will. And every society has moments like this, moments deliberately hidden, moments that reveal the undercurrent of fear and control running beneath the surface of civilization. The elite will bury it, sanitize it, disguise it, but the lesson remains, etched in memory, waiting for those bold enough to notice. Tonight, as you listen, consider this. What structures in your world rely on invisible obedience? What forces operate in the shadows, manipulating perception, shaping belief, controlling outcomes? And when you recognize them, do you stand as a witness, or do you step into the shadows yourself, understanding the rules they never wanted you to see? To understand what she did, you must step beyond the literal. This was not merely a woman lashing out. This was an archetype in motion, a force of suppressed power, patience, and calculated retribution. For centuries, she had been invisible, overlooked, dismissed. Every insult, every act of cruelty, every assumption of inferiority was stored, not as anger, but as raw intelligence. The human mind, when oppressed, does not always break. It adapts. It learns the weaknesses of those in power. It maps every corridor, every flinch, every arrogance. And when the moment is right, it strikes with precision that can seem supernatural to those who cannot comprehend it. Her vengeance was not chaos. It was choreography. Each action was deliberate, each outcome anticipated. The 7 deaths were not random. They were calculated, a reflection of her understanding of cause and effect, of fear and perception. She turned the very architecture of the house, the assumptions of the elite, and the fragility of their ego into instruments of control. In doing so, she demonstrated a principle that history hides. Power can be reversed if one understands its mechanics. It is not about strength alone. It is about timing, intelligence, and invisibility. Consider what this reveals about society, about human systems. Most people believe dominance is absolute, that those at the top are untouchable. But dominance is a fragile construct, propped up by fear, obedience, and assumption. Remove any of these supports, and it collapses. She understood this better than anyone in that room. Her patience turned invisibility into strategy. Her observation turned assumption into vulnerability. And her courage, yes, courage, is the element most people miss. The willingness to act when the world expects an action. This is why her story matters, beyond the immediate horror. It is a lesson in psychological mastery, in the unseen forces that govern human behavior. It teaches that systems of control are always vulnerable to the perceptive, the patient, the underestimated. It warns the complacent, never assume that those you oppress cannot shape your reality. And it illuminates a truth most fear to acknowledge. Survival, influence, and power do not always belong to the visible. By now, if you are listening closely, you are beginning to see the pattern. The story is no longer about one night, one estate, or one tragedy. It is about the principles hidden in plain sight. And if you want to engage fully, write this phrase in the comments twice. I see what they hide. Not once, but twice. Lock it in. Let it mark the moment you start recognizing the hidden forces shaping every structure, every hierarchy, every system around you. What occurred that night did not happen in isolation. It was the product of centuries of structural control, of invisible rules that govern the powerful and protect the powerless, at least in appearance. Societies, especially those built on hierarchy and privilege, thrive on illusion. They rely on obedience, on ritualized submission, and on the careful suppression of truth. The master's estate was not merely a home, it was a microcosm of these forces, a laboratory for control, where status, fear, and tradition intertwined to create an environment where authority appeared absolute. Yet absolute authority is always fragile. Systems of control only endure when they are unquestioned. The guests, the servants, the master himself, they all assumed the rules of dominance were permanent. They believed that the social contract guaranteed their safety or their superiority. But they had forgotten a fundamental truth. Systems are vulnerable not only to external threats, but to insight from those who live within them. She had been embedded in this system for years, learning its patterns, understanding its weaknesses, and waiting for the precise moment to exploit them. The implications are chilling. Every institution, no matter how rigid it seems, has blind spots. Every hierarchy, no matter how powerful it appears, can be undermined by awareness and strategic patience. History is filled with moments like this, moments deliberately obscured because they reveal the fragility of control. Governments, corporations, social structures, they all rely on obedience, fear, and conformity. And when these are disrupted, chaos follows, often in ways that the privileged cannot anticipate. This is why a story is more than a historical curiosity. It is a blueprint for understanding invisible power dynamics. It demonstrates how control is maintained, how it can be exploited, and how it can collapse under the right conditions. It forces you to look at every system around you, not as stable, not as unshakable, but as a set of moving parts, vulnerable to those who understand the architecture of perception, fear, and obedience. And here's the most dangerous truth. Society works hard to hide these lessons. Official records sanitize them. Stories are rewritten. Memories are erased. Knowledge of human fragility is suppressed because it threatens the comfortable illusion of permanence. But if you are paying attention, if you are willing to look, you begin to see the cracks, the moments when the invisible rules are bent, broken, or weaponized. That night, in 1859, the cracks became a chasm. And the lesson is as true today as it was then. The unseen forces shape reality far more than the visible ones ever could. Survivors rarely speak of what they truly experienced that night. Not because they forgot, but because the human mind instinctively tries to protect itself from truths too violent to endure. What they witnessed was not merely death. It was the collapse of perceived order. Every assumption they held about power, safety, and control shattered in seconds. And when the mind faces such rupture, it retreats, creating layers of denial, suppression, and distortion. The psychological terror began in subtle ways. Feist, a creeping sense of vulnerability. Simple things, footsteps, shadows, the flicker of a candle, triggered memories of the night. Panic became a constant companion because they had learned the world was far less predictable than they had believed. Second, guilt. The surviving guests carried the weight of inaction. They had laughed, they had mocked, they had ignored warnings that now seemed obvious. That laughter became poison in their memories, twisting into shame and fear. And then came obsession. The The master, in particular, could no longer distinguish between reality and threat. Every shadow, every servant, every unexpected sound became a potential harbinger of destruction. This is the mechanism of control that she had mastered, instilling fear so profound it outlives the immediate moment. Fear, when applied with precision, rewires thought. It fractures perception, and the survivors were now prisoners of a truth they could not publicly acknowledge, yet could never unsee. The lesson embedded in this horror is universal. Institutions rely on fear, but they also rely on predictability. Break predictability, and the carefully constructed chains of obedience collapse. When the woman struck that night, she did not merely kill. She demonstrated the psychological leverage inherent in awareness, preparation, and patience. She weaponized the invisible structures that sustained hierarchy, turning them against the very people who depended on them. This is why her story remains dangerous knowledge. It teaches that the most effective power does not roar. It whispers. It moves unseen. It exploits assumptions. And it leaves an imprint that lingers far beyond the moment of physical action. For those who survived, life became a series of cautionary tremors, reminders that the world is not as stable as they were taught to believe. And for anyone listening to this story now, there is a question you must ask yourself. How many of your assumptions, how many of your rules, how many of your beliefs are invisible prisons? What she did that night was more than personal revenge. It was a statement, a mirror held up to every system of dominance that had trained people to believe in their invincibility. Each death, each moment of terror, was a lesson in the psychology of underestimation. She became an embodiment of a principle so few grasp. The invisible, the overlooked, the dismissed often hold the greatest power. And the world, so confident in hierarchy, rarely notices until it is too late. Her actions are archetypal. They echo through history in countless forms. The slave who outsmarts the tyrant, the overlooked individual who exploits structural weakness, the quiet mind that turns patience into precision. These moments are rare, yes, but they are always devastating. They reveal truths the powerful hope remain hidden. Obedience is conditional. Control is an illusion, and fear can be wielded by the smallest, least noticed hand. Consider the mechanics of what she achieved. She used observation as armor, patience as weapon, and perception as leverage. The mansion was a battlefield, but the real victory was psychological. By the time the first candle fell and panic spread, she had already won. Every guest, every member of the household, became a puppet to her understanding of fear, hierarchy, and anticipation. The deaths were not random, they were predictable, precise, and unavoidable for those who had ignored the warning signs. There is a brutal lesson here for anyone who studies power. The underestimated mind is the most dangerous. The world teaches people to look at appearances, to measure threat by strength, title, or wealth. But influence does not always manifest visibly. The most effective control is invisible. The most profound vengeance is subtle, patient, and exact. And she understood this perfectly, transforming oppression into advantage, invisibility into command, and observation into dominion. This is why her story resonates far beyond 1859. It is a template, a demonstration, a warning. The forces that operate unseen in your world, within institutions, hierarchies, and social structures, are always vulnerable to insight, strategy, and patience. Recognize this. Remember it. And if you have already written the phrase, "I see what they hide" twice in the comments, feel it now. The shift has begun. Your awareness, your perception, your understanding of hidden forces is the first step toward mastery of a world designed to keep you blind. The world responded as it always does to knowledge it cannot control. It buried it. The massacre was too dangerous to acknowledge openly. It revealed the fragility of hierarchy, the vulnerability of the powerful, and the terrifying potential of those they had deemed invisible. So the story was sanitized. Records were rewritten. Witnesses were coerced into silence. Rumors circulated, but official history ignored the lessons embedded in that night. And this is no accident. It is a pattern repeated through time. Society's response was a lesson in control. When the elite cannot prevent a disruption, they manipulate perception. They erase details, distort facts, and shape narratives to preserve authority. The survivors were instructed to conform, to obey, to behave as if the impossible had never occurred. And they did, not out of loyalty, but because fear had already taken hold. They had experienced firsthand the collapse of assumed power, and the world around them reinforced their silence with subtle, relentless pressure. This is the method by which systems maintain themselves. The rules are never fully transparent. Obedience is enforced not only through overt threats but through the careful shaping of memory, the selective recording of events, and the suppression of inconvenient truths. History is never neutral. It is curated by those who fear exposure. And the events of 1859 demonstrate the extremes of this process. The woman's actions were a revelation, but society ensured the revelation was smothered before it could inspire understanding or rebellion. And yet, for those who seek to see beyond the surface, the traces remain. The fear, the stories whispered in shadows, the inexplicable gaps in records. They are markers, breadcrumbs for the observant. They tell you that the world is not as it seems. That power is fragile. That perception shapes reality more than brute strength ever could. And they remind you that those who are underestimated may possess the most dangerous knowledge, the ability to reshape the world from within, invisibly, without warning, and with devastating precision. This is why what you are learning now is dangerous. Knowledge of hidden forces changes the way you perceive authority, obedience, and control. It makes the illusions crumble. And it is exactly the kind of awareness those in power seek to suppress. If you are listening, if you are paying attention, understand this. Every system has a weakness, every hierarchy has a blind spot, and every invisible force, like the one that orchestrated 7 deaths in a single night, can alter reality when applied with knowledge, patience, and precision. Fear is a force few truly understand. It is not just an emotion, it is a lever, a tool, a silent hand that shapes behavior, perception, and decision-making. And that night in 1859, the woman demonstrated mastery over it in a way most people will never witness. She did not strike with brute force. She did not shout, threaten, or announce her intent. She allowed fear to grow naturally, subtly, until it became a living presence in the room. It moved through the guests like a ghost, unseen but undeniably real. Every creaking floorboard, every flicker of candlelight, every shadow suddenly misplaced became a signal. Each of these small details was amplified in the minds of the elite, their assumptions exploited to maximum effect. Fear is contagious. It feeds on expectation and disbelief. The guests, conditioned to believe in their safety and superiority, were blind to the reality forming around them. Their panic was predictable, and she had orchestrated it. She became the invisible architect of a psychological collapse, manipulating perception without a single direct confrontation. The master, intoxicated by hubris and social dominance, failed to see the pattern forming. Fear had already entered his mind, altering his judgment, eroding his confidence, and turning his ego into a liability. He had built his identity on control, yet control is fragile when the rules you depend on can be bent by someone who understands the psychology of anticipation. And when the first screams finally pierced the hole, the terror was no longer subtle. It had taken form, precise, unrelenting, and unavoidable. This is a principle that extends far beyond that estate. Fear, when applied strategically, can be more powerful than physical force. Systems, institutions, even individuals rely on predictability and obedience. Disrupt the perception of safety. Introduce uncertainty, observation, and precise leverage, and you can influence outcomes far greater than raw strength would allow. She understood this. She weaponized it. And her victims, bound by assumption and arrogance, became captives to a power they could not perceive until it was too late. This is the dangerous knowledge buried in history. Fear is invisible, yet it shapes the visible world. Control is an illusion, unless you understand the psychological structures that maintain it. And those who are underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed often hold the key to mastery over it. Tonight, if you are listening, pay attention to the shadows around you. The patterns, the silences, the subtle movements. They may be more powerful than anything you see. The unseen is always stronger than the obvious, if you know how to use it. The house was no longer just a home. That night, it became a weapon, molded by her mind. Every corridor, every staircase, every shadowed corner was a piece in her design. To the guests, it appeared ordinary, familiar, but she had internalized its every detail. She knew which floorboards would groan, which doors would jam, which flickers of candlelight would draw attention. exactly where she wanted. The estate, once a symbol of her oppression, became the instrument of her power. She did not need to wield a knife. She had already transformed the environment into an extension of her will. This is the essence of spatial mastery. Power is not always direct. It can be woven into the fabric of the world around you. People move through spaces assuming control is static, that the architecture is neutral. But every structure has leverage points, weaknesses, and predictable responses. She understood this. Every movement of the guests, every instinctual reaction to light, shadow, and sound was anticipated. Every panic-driven step furthered the cascade of chaos she had meticulously designed. It is here, in the subtle manipulation of environment, that most people fail to see power. Control is rarely physical. It is situational, perceptual, psychological. She orchestrated the night as if she were conducting a symphony of fear, and the mansion itself responded to her commands. By the time chaos erupted, the guests were trapped in a living system of their own reactions, manipulated by knowledge they did not even realize existed. This mastery reveals a timeless truth. Environments are extensions of influence. To understand a system, whether a building, an organization, or a society, is to see how it can be directed, leveraged, and, if necessary, weaponized. And those who are underestimated, like she was, can use what is overlooked to exert disproportionate power. She turned the estate into a trap not because of brute force, but because she understood its hidden dynamics better than anyone who believed themselves superior. Tonight, if you are listening, reflect on the spaces you inhabit. Consider the unseen forces in your surroundings, the patterns, the weaknesses, the leverage points. The invisible architecture of influence shapes behavior far more than you suspect. And when it is understood and applied with patience, observation, and precision, it can change everything. She did not just survive her world, she rewrote it. And the lessons remain, waiting for those willing to see what the powerful tried to conceal. 7 people died that night, but their deaths were more than mere numbers. They were symbols. Each one represented arrogance, complacency, and the illusion of control. The master, intoxicated by pride, believed himself untouchable. The guests, conditioned by privilege, assumed safety. And the world, steeped in hierarchy, expected obedience. Their death shattered these assumptions. They became warnings etched in flesh, shadows, and memory, proof that perceived invulnerability is fragile, that underestimation is fatal. The shockwaves extended far beyond the walls of the mansion. Survivors carried a psychological burden that no society wanted acknowledged. Fear became their constant companion. Guilt seeped into their thoughts, twisting laughter into shame, complacency into obsession. Those who observed from a distance whispered rumors, but official records erased the horror. The lesson, the fragility of power, the potency of invisibility, the lethal precision of calculated patience, was deliberately suppressed. History, as usual, prioritized comfort over truth. Symbolically, the deaths demonstrate an uncomfortable principle. Systems and hierarchies exist only so long as they are believed unbreakable. Every institution, every social contract, every law relies on compliance, assumption, and the ignorance of those at the bottom. Break that pattern, and the illusion of control collapses. The woman did not simply exact vengeance. She exposed the fragility of structures everyone trusted. In doing so, she illuminated a truth most will never admit. The weak, the overlooked, and the invisible are often the most capable of altering reality. And the consequences are psychological as well as social. The survivors' minds became prisons of awareness, forever haunted by the knowledge that order is fragile and perception is the true arbiter of power. They learned that authority is contingent, and that confidence built on assumption is a liability. And this is precisely why those in power work so hard to sanitize history, to remove stories like hairs from memory. Knowledge of these truths threatens the comfort of obedience and the illusion of permanence. Listen carefully, because this is a lesson that transcends time and geography. Every hierarchy you observe, corporate, political, social, operates on the same principles. Every assumption about safety, dominance, and control is contingent on your ignorance. And when awareness enters, when perception shifts, when fear and intelligence converge, the strongest structures can collapse as swiftly as they were built. This is the hidden knowledge that history hides, the kind that changes the way a man sees the world forever. The most dangerous force in any system is the mind that is overlooked. Society trains people to notice the obvious, to fear the loud, to respect the titled. But the quiet observer, the one who absorbs, calculates, and waits, possesses a type of power the world rarely anticipates. The woman in 1859 embodies this principle perfectly. Her patience, her invisibility, and her relentless attention to detail made her untouchable until the exact moment she chose to act. And that moment reshaped reality entirely. There is a psychological law at work here. Underestimated individuals are underestimated precisely because their power is invisible. The world measures strength by display, by volume, by aggression, but true influence often operates silently, beneath the radar. Awareness, patience, and strategic intelligence become invisible weapons, capable of dismantling even the most rigid hierarchies. She did not need to announce herself. She did not need approval. She only needed understanding, an intimate comprehension of the system, the people, and the rules they assumed were immutable. Philosophically, this teaches a profound lesson about human potential. Power is not always about domination. It is about perception, timing, and leverage. Those who can read the room, the environment, and the psychology of others can rewrite outcomes far greater than those who rely on brute force or inherited authority. Every assumption about strength is a potential vulnerability. Every ignored presence, every overlooked detail, is an opportunity. And she exploited all of them. This is why history hides stories like hers. They threaten our assumptions about control, order, and authority. They remind the powerful that dominance is fragile and the invisible always waits. And they offer the perceptive a blueprint for mastery. Learn the environment, observe quietly, store knowledge, wait, and act with precision. The mastery of patience, strategy, and perception is timeless. It does not belong to any one era, class, or title. It belongs to those who understand that power is not what is visible. It is what is unseen, unacknowledged, and underestimated. And now, as you listen, ask yourself, what in your world is invisible to those around you? What overlooked knowledge, what patience, what quiet observation could one day tip the scales? Remember the lesson of 1859. Underestimated forces can reshape reality. And if you want to seal that awareness, write the phrase "I see what they hide" twice in the comments again. Let it anchor the shift in perception, the awakening that changes the way you understand power forever. Society has a way of burying truths that threaten comfort. History is rewritten not to illuminate, but to obscure. Events like the 1859 massacre are sanitized, distorted, or forgotten because they expose vulnerabilities the powerful cannot afford to acknowledge. Myths are created, stories that reinforce obedience, justify hierarchy, and convince the masses that control is absolute. But underneath the veneer of these narratives, the real lessons lie hidden, waiting for those brave enough to look. The suppression of truth is itself a tool of power. By controlling perception, the elite ensures that knowledge of human fragility and invisible influence never spreads. The world is taught to see only what is safe, acceptable, and convenient. They emphasize wealth, brute force, and status, while ignoring subtle intelligence, patient strategy, and perceptual mastery. And yet, beneath every myth, beneath every sanitized record, lies evidence of a different reality. Control is conditional, hierarchies are fragile, and the underestimated are capable of altering events in ways history rarely acknowledges. This is why her story is dangerous knowledge. It threatens the illusions that uphold obedience. It demonstrates that the invisible, the patient, and the overlooked hold power far greater than any who parade their authority. And it is why the lesson must be recognized, not ignored. The real danger in history is not the visible threat. It is the silent, unseen forces operating inside every system, reshaping outcomes while the world believes it observes control. Philosophically, this is a call to awareness. Systems rely on assumptions, myths, and sanitized memory. They thrive on the belief that dominance is immutable. But once perception shifts, once someone sees the cracks, the blind spots, the hidden dynamics, the balance changes. The world is not as stable as it seems. Every institution, every hierarchy, every law is vulnerable to insight, strategy, and patience. And those who understand this can operate far beyond what conventional measures of strength suggest. Tonight, consider the stories you are told, the assumptions you carry, and the truths deliberately hidden. Ask yourself, what has been sanitized? What has been distorted? And what forces lie invisible, waiting for the moment to exert influence? The massacre of 1859 is more than a historical horror. It is a map, a warning, and a lesson in the fragility of power. And if you are ready to step deeper into understanding, remember the phrase, "I see what they hide." Twice. Let it mark the moment your perception begins to outpace the illusions of the world. The elite are experts at self-deception. They surround themselves with narratives that justify cruelty, normalize oppression, and obscure accountability. The events of 1859 were not just a personal tragedy. They were a systemic warning that could have unraveled the very illusions on which their society depended. Yet they rationalized, dismissed, and even celebrated aspects of it. Why? Because acknowledging the truth would force them to confront the fragility of their dominance, and the terrifying reality that control is never guaranteed. Psychologically, this is a survival mechanism. Humans instinctively minimize threats they cannot manage. The powerful convince themselves that those they oppress are harmless, that the rules are permanent, that the world bends to their authority. They rationalize horrors as exceptions, anomalies, or entertainment. This allows them to maintain a sense of order, security, and moral superiority. But every rationalization is a blindfold. Every dismissal is a doorway to disaster. The mansion that night became a mirror to this reality. Every gasp, every scream, every death exposed the cracks in the assumptions that sustained the elite. They were confronted with evidence that power is fragile, perception is malleable, and the underestimated can overturn even the most rigid hierarchies. And yet, instead of fully reckoning with the implications, they buried it beneath laughter, whispers, and myth. They sanitized history to preserve comfort and authority. This is why stories like hers are dangerous to the structures of control. They reveal the mechanisms that uphold dominance, fear, obedience, ignorance, and the strategic dismissal of inconvenient truths. They teach that stability is never inherent. It is maintained only so long as perception is controlled and assumptions go untested. Once someone sees the cracks, once someone exploits the invisible weaknesses, the system becomes vulnerable. And that vulnerability, once awakened, can never be fully erased. For those who listen now, the lesson is clear. Never trust narratives that sanitize or rationalize the inconvenient. Observe the gaps, the silences, the stories that are too carefully polished. Power thrives on perception, and those who control perception shape reality itself. The massacre of 1859 is more than a horror story. It is a blueprint for understanding fragility, a guide to recognizing the underestimated, and a warning that the invisible forces around us are far more influential than the visible structures we rely on. The events of 1859 were more than physical, they were archetypal. The woman in that house embodies a timeless force, the underestimated agent of change, the silent intelligence that upends assumed hierarchies. Across history, this archetype repeats. The oppressed who observe, the overlooked who calculate, the invisible who shape outcomes. These figures exist wherever power relies on assumptions, obedience, and fear. Their actions ripple beyond the moment, exposing truths most would rather ignore. Psychologically, her mastery speaks to the universal principle that patience and observation outweigh brute force. The world measures strength by what is visible, wealth, size, aggression, status. Yet true influence flows unseen. It manifests in perception, timing, and strategic control over environments and minds. She weaponized all of these elements, transforming her invisibility into dominion. Her actions were not chaos, they were inevitability, a culmination of intelligence and precision that history often hides because it challenges the comfortable myths of control. Symbolically, the deaths that night represent the collapse of illusion. The 7 lives lost were markers, each a demonstration of arrogance, complacency, and the consequences of underestimating the unseen. They serve as a warning across generations. Do not assume dominance is absolute. The weak are often far more capable than the powerful realize. The invisible, patient, and observant can disrupt entire systems when their intelligence is aligned with opportunity. This archetype is not constrained to the past. It exists in every institution, every hierarchy, every human interaction. The principle is eternal. Perception shapes reality. Control is conditional. The underestimated hold the greatest potential to rewrite outcomes, and those who fail to recognize it remain vulnerable, blind to the silent forces at work around them. If you are listening, Consider what this means for your life, your systems, and your understanding of power. The story is not just history, it is a mirror. It asks you to see, to observe, and to understand the invisible dynamics that dictate the visible world. And if you have not yet written it, now is the moment. Repeat in the comments, "I see what they hide" twice. Lock in the awareness, solidify the shift, and recognize that knowledge of the unseen is the most powerful tool any man can possess. True control begins not with force, but with perception. She understood this instinctively. The guests believed they were the observers, but in reality, they were the observed. Every glance, every movement, every heartbeat played into her design. She manipulated attention like a conductor, directing focus toward the irrelevant while the critical levers of control moved unseen. Fear, expectation, and misperception became her instruments, and the mansion responded as if alive. Attention is fragile, and humans are predictable. She exploited this with precision. A misstep here, a flicker of candlelight there, a whispered noise just at the edge of hearing, each carefully timed to maximize uncertainty. Panic is cumulative. It grows faster in a crowd. And the elite, conditioned by pride and assumption, were the perfect subjects. Their minds filled in gaps with dread, their assumptions became liabilities, and their fear became a force she could wield like a weapon. Expectation is another tool. The master and his guests expected obedience, predictability, and control. They believed hierarchy guaranteed safety. She broke this assumption slowly, deliberately. Nothing seemed overtly threatening at first. Every small anomaly appeared accidental, and by the time the first scream erupted, the psychological groundwork was complete. The collapse was inevitable. They had been trained to obey, and now their obedience was irrelevant. Their minds were prisoners of an invisible hand they never saw coming. This is the essence of her mastery, manipulating the rules people believe are fixed. She reshaped reality not through violence alone, but through perception, attention, and expectation. The room became her stage, the guests her instruments, and fear the language that orchestrated the outcome. 7 deaths were not the result of brute force. They were the natural consequence of invisible influence applied with strategic intelligence. Tonight, if you listen closely, ask yourself, how many invisible forces shape your reality? How much of what you perceive is curated, guided, or manipulated? Understanding the mechanics of perception is more dangerous than any weapon. And those who can see and influence unseen dynamics hold power far beyond what appearances suggest. The woman of 1859 teaches that domination is fragile, perception is pliable, and intelligence, quiet, patient, precise intelligence, can rewrite outcomes in ways no amount of authority or arrogance can resist. The witnesses of that night did not simply survive, they were transformed. Fear reshaped their minds, guilt twisted their memories, and the knowledge of fragility lingered like a shadow they could never escape. Those who lived through the massacre carried invisible scars, not on their bodies, but in their perception of reality. They understood, in ways they could not articulate, that authority is conditional, and that the powerless, if underestimated, can wield a control far greater than society allows itself to acknowledge. Their transformation was psychological. They began to see patterns previously invisible. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle shift in the environment reminded them that dominance is never absolute. Obedience is a fragile construct, reliant on assumptions that can be exploited. And guilt became a persistent companion, a reminder that they had witnessed events they could neither prevent nor fully explain. Each survivor became a living monument to the lessons they had learned too late. This is a principle that extends far beyond one mansion or one night. Human systems, families, corporations, governments, rely on predictability and perception. When these are disrupted, those who survive carry knowledge that cannot be erased. They see the cracks, the blind spots, and the invisible levers of influence. And in that knowledge lies power. If one is willing to act with the same patience and awareness that shaped the events of 1859. The symbolic meaning of the witnesses' experience is profound. They were forced to confront a reality that most will never see. Power is mutable, perception is malleable, and even the seemingly powerless can rewrite outcomes when strategy and patience are applied. They became conduits of a dangerous truth, an inconvenient lesson that those in authority prefer to erase from history. Their transformation was the psychological echo of a mastery, proof that influence extends beyond the immediate physical impact into the minds of all who observe. If you are listening, consider the lessons carried by the witnesses. How fragile are the systems you trust? How often do assumptions mask real vulnerabilities? And how much power lies hidden, invisible to those blinded by authority? Understanding these lessons is not just academic. It is a step toward mastery of perception, awareness, and the unseen dynamics that shape every structure and every life. History rarely tells the full story. Events like the 1859 massacre are inconvenient, dangerous, and destabilizing. They expose the fragility of authority and the potency of the underestimated. So society responded predictably. It rewrote, sanitized, and suppressed. Official records omitted the details, historians ignored the implications, and the whispers that survived were cloaked in rumor and myth. Knowledge of what truly happened became a hidden force, available only to those willing to see beyond the veil of accepted history. This erasure is deliberate. The powerful maintain dominance not just through force, but through control of narrative. By shaping collective memory, they enforce obedience and maintain the illusion of permanence. They sanitize events that reveal the instability of hierarchy and the effectiveness of patient, invisible influence. 7 deaths, precise, calculated, and symbolic, reduced to footnotes or ignored entirely. The lesson she imposed on that night was too dangerous to preserve in plain sight. Yet traces remain. Odd gaps in records, subtle inconsistencies in accounts, and stories whispered in shadow hint at the deeper reality. These fragments are markers for those who know how to read them, breadcrumbs pointing to the mechanisms of fear, manipulation, and strategic intelligence. If you are attentive, you begin to recognize the patterns, the silences, the distortions, the deliberate omissions. They reveal a system that fears the invisible and punishes awareness. The lesson here is timeless. Control depends not on inevitability, but on the suppression of inconvenient truths. History is curated to protect those in power, not to educate or awaken. And those who understand this can see the gaps, perceive the hidden forces, and act where others are blind. Her story, buried though it was, survives as a blueprint for understanding the invisible levers of influence, the fragility of perceived dominance, and the consequences of underestimating forces deemed powerless. Tonight, as you listen, ask yourself, what truths in your world are being hidden? What knowledge is deliberately obscured to preserve comfort and authority? Recognizing the suppression itself is a tool of power. And if you have not already, repeat in the comments, I see what they hide twice. Anchor the awareness, claim the understanding, and step into the knowledge that the world relies on your ignorance to maintain control. Control is rarely chaotic. It is deliberate, structured, and reinforced over generations. The events of 1859 reveal a microcosm of a much larger system. Institutions, families, governments, corporations, religious hierarchies depend on obedience, fear, and selective knowledge. They train participants to follow rules unquestioningly, to suppress curiosity, and to avoid observing the cracks in authority. This is the invisible architecture of power, quietly shaping behavior and preserving dominance without the need for overt force. Fear is a critical tool in this architecture. It is subtle, cumulative, and often internalized. People do not obey merely because of punishment. They obey because they have been conditioned to anticipate danger, shame, or exclusion. Over time, obedience becomes second nature. The master in 1859 relied on this instinct in his guests, assuming that hierarchy and tradition guaranteed compliance. He failed to see that fear, when mismanaged, can backfire catastrophically, and that those he underestimated had learned to exploit it. Knowledge suppression is another pillar. Systems maintain themselves by hiding truths that could destabilize perception. The massacre, precise and calculated, was erased from history not because it lacked significance, but because it revealed uncomfortable realities, the fragility of authority, the potency of patience, and the invisible mastery of the underestimated. By controlling memory, by shaping narrative, institutions ensure that awareness remains partial, incomplete, and safe for the dominant. Yet the most insidious mechanism is perception management. Systems teach participants to focus on the visible, measurable, and conventional. They ignore subtle signals, hidden dynamics, and patterns that challenge assumptions. And those who observe and act on these invisible patterns, the quiet, patient, and strategic, hold disproportionate power. The woman of 1859 exploited exactly this: the blind spots, the conditioned predictability, the overconfidence of the powerful. Her intelligence turned the very mechanisms designed to enforce obedience into instruments of destruction. Tonight, consider this carefully. Every hierarchy you encounter operates on these same principles. Fear, obedience, selective knowledge, and perception management maintain control. And every system has blind spots, moments of vulnerability, and underestimated forces waiting to act. Understanding these dynamics is dangerous knowledge. It is knowledge deliberately hidden because it threatens the illusions on which power is built. And by observing it, you step closer to mastery of the unseen. Survivors of moments like 1859 carry more than memories. They carry transformations. The collapse of assumed authority imprints on the psyche, reshaping perception, expectation, and trust. Every decision afterward is filtered through the understanding that dominance is conditional, obedience is fragile, and invisibility can hold more power than display. These are not fleeting insights. They become part of the survivor's internal architecture, guiding thought and behavior long after the immediate danger has passed. Fear and guilt intertwine, creating a psychological ecosystem that cannot be easily undone. Those who witnessed the massacre learned that assumptions can be deadly, that arrogance can be weaponized against its owners, and that intelligence and patience are formidable tools. The mind, once exposed to this reality, cannot return fully to its previous state. It retains an awareness of fragility, an understanding that systems are malleable, and a respect for forces that operate unseen. These lessons persist not just for individuals, but across generations. Survivors pass down knowledge subtly, through caution, stories, and behavior, even when history refuses to record it accurately. Myths, whispers, and family memories carry the essence of the truth, encoding understanding of hierarchy, vulnerability, and invisible power. And in this way, knowledge that is forbidden or suppressed becomes almost impossible to eradicate entirely. It survives in perception, intuition, and the quiet recognition of patterns others overlook. This is why the story of 1859 is more than historical horror. It is psychological instruction. It teaches that collapse of authority is not an anomaly, but a principle of human systems. It warns that fear, obedience, and perception can be manipulated both to oppress and to liberate. And it demonstrates that the underestimated, when patient and intelligent, can reshape reality in ways that reverberate far beyond a single moment. As you listen, reflect on the long-term impact of awareness. Knowledge of hidden dynamics, once internalized, changes behavior, decisions, and perception permanently. The lesson is not just about that mansion or that night. It is about understanding the invisible forces in every environment, the blind spots in every system, and the latent power in patience, observation, and strategic action. And now, if you haven't already, write in the comments "I see what they hide" twice. Lock in this transformation and anchor your understanding of the unseen forces shaping the world around you. Hierarchy is an illusion until it is tested. The events of 1859 reveal a principle often ignored: the visible markers of power, titles, wealth, physical dominance, do not guarantee control. Perception shapes reality, and the underestimated, when patient and intelligent, can exploit the very structures designed to enforce obedience. The woman in that mansion embodies this archetype: quiet, overlooked, underestimated, yet capable of recalibrating reality itself in a single night. This archetype recurs throughout history: the oppressed who observe, the invisible who calculate, the underestimated who wait. These are the forces that disrupt every assumed order. They operate where authority assumes stability, striking precisely when systems depend on predictability. And their power is amplified by the arrogance of those who ignore the subtle, the quiet, the unseen. Each act of disruption becomes a lesson, a warning encoded in memory and story, though often erased from official history. Perception is central. The elite act on assumptions that obedience is reliable, that fear is manageable, and that those without status cannot influence outcomes. The woman shattered these assumptions effortlessly. She understood the dynamics of attention, expectation, and psychological leverage. Her mastery over these forces allowed her to weaponize invisibility, patience, and intelligence into a form of power that brute strength could never match. The hierarchy she dismantled was fragile because it was assumed permanent. The symbolic resonance is profound. Every unnoticed individual, every quiet observer, every patient mind carries potential power that systems rarely anticipate. The underestimated are often the architects of change, the catalysts of collapse, the hidden forces that rewrite outcomes without being seen. And this principle is timeless. From corporate boardrooms to political institutions, from families to entire civilizations, the archetype persists. Those who are overlooked often hold the greatest capacity to influence, disrupt, and dominate when they understand perception and control. For you listening now, the lesson is personal as well as universal. Recognize the blind spots in your world. Observe what others dismiss. Understand that hierarchy, authority, and control are conditional, and that patience, insight, and strategic intelligence are invisible forces of transformation. And if you have not yet done so, anchor this understanding. Write in the comments, "I see what they hide" twice. Solidify your awareness, and mark the moment you begin to perceive the invisible dynamics shaping every reality around you. What happened that night was not chaos. It was orchestration. Every movement, every reaction, every scream was anticipated. The woman's mastery lay in her ability to see beyond the immediate, to map the behaviors of those around her, and to exploit their assumptions with surgical precision. Patience, observation, and timing became her deadliest weapons. Brute force was unnecessary. The system itself, combined with human psychology, performed the work for her. This is a principle that transcends the mansion and the era. Calculated patience always outperforms impulsive strength. The world rewards those who react without foresight, and punishes those who underestimate silent, deliberate actors. The guests believed dominance belonged to the bold, the loud, the titled. They were blind to the quiet intelligence orchestrating every outcome. By waiting, by observing, by understanding the patterns of expectation, she gained an exponential advantage. The result was both inevitable and devastating. Every element of the mansion, the shadows, the layout, the sounds, the assumptions of the powerful, was leveraged. Her intelligence transformed ordinary circumstances into a weaponized environment. Each misstep by the guests, each subtle indication of fear, became a trigger she had anticipated. And when the first moments of panic erupted, the cascading effect was unstoppable. She did not need to chase, fight, or threaten. She had already aligned perception, environment, and expectation to achieve her ends. This is the lesson for anyone seeking mastery over invisible forces. Brute strength is temporary, visible dominance is fragile, and impatience is exploitable. Observation, patience, and strategic timing allow an underestimated actor to wield control far beyond what appearances suggest. The most dangerous power is invisible until it manifests precisely at the right moment. And history is full of examples, though rarely acknowledged, of individuals who operate this way. Tonight, reflect on the implications. How often do people around you act without foresight? How often is control assumed rather than earned through intelligence? And how much potential do you carry, silently, simply by observing, waiting, and understanding the patterns others ignore? The woman of 1859 is not just a historical figure. She is a blueprint. If you have not yet done so, write in the comments, "I see what they hide" twice. Let it anchor your understanding that calculated patience is the invisible weapon of the powerful. Arrogance is the natural enemy of awareness. The master in 1859, and the guests around him, believed in their invulnerability. Their sense of superiority blinded them to the subtle dynamics unfolding under their noses. This is a pattern repeated endlessly across history. Those who assume strength cannot be challenged are the first to fall when underestimated forces act with patience and intelligence. Arrogance is not just pride. It is a lens that distorts reality, masking vulnerability and inviting disaster. The social consequences of underestimation are profound. Communities, institutions, and even families operate on assumptions about competence and authority. When someone is dismissed as weak, irrelevant, or powerless, the system assumes safety. The invisible actor, quiet and patient, then has freedom to observe, exploit, and reshape outcomes. 7 deaths in a single night were not random. They were the product of this precise dynamic. Society's arrogance ensured that no one saw the danger coming until it had already manifested. This principle extends far beyond one mansion. Corporations collapse because executives dismiss overlooked talent. Governments fail because hidden forces exploit blind spots. Social hierarchies crumble because individuals underestimate the patient, the quiet, the intelligent. The consequences are rarely immediate, but when they arrive, they are absolute. The lesson is clear. What you ignore today may be the very force that overturns everything you depend on tomorrow. Underestimation is compounded by narrative control. Those who survive or witness such events often cannot speak openly. Rumors, myths, and sanitization erase the truth from public consciousness. But the lesson remains encoded in perception, memory, and subtle cues. Fear, observation, and strategic intelligence persist, shaping the behavior of those who understand. And the underestimated, once recognized, are capable of rewriting the rules entirely, without notice. For anyone listening now, the question is personal. Who do you dismiss? What patterns, people, or forces do you assume powerless? How much of your world is constructed on arrogance and assumption? Recognizing underestimation is the first step toward mastering invisible dynamics. And if you have not yet done so, write in the comments "I see what they hide" twice. Seal the awareness, anchor the shift, and embrace the principle that arrogance blinds, while perception and patience empower. Control is rarely isolated. It is a network, a system, a web of influence that extends beyond a single event or individual. The massacre of 1859 was a microcosm of these mechanisms, but the principles it reveals are universal. Social, psychological, and environmental forces intersect to maintain dominance. Fear is reinforced, perception is shaped, and knowledge is selectively allowed to propagate. In this way, the world ensures obedience without overt oppression, subtlety outperforming brutality. The environment itself is a tool of influence. The mansion, the layout, the shadows, even the patterns of movement were manipulated to produce predictable reactions. Social structures amplify this effect. Humans are conditioned to assume safety and stability in familiar spaces, making them vulnerable to disruption. The invisible hand of intelligence exploits these assumptions, aligning perception with the desired outcome. The result is control that feels natural, inevitable, and unquestionable to those subject to it. Psychological manipulation is equally pervasive. Individuals are guided by expectation, conditioned by authority, and constrained by social norms. The guests in 1859 assumed compliance and hierarchy guaranteed safety. Their fear, once triggered, became an uncontrollable force precisely because it was predictable. Systems of control, when designed with insight into human perception, replicate this effect across generations, shaping behavior without overt coercion. And social manipulation compounds the effect. Survivors carry lessons they cannot fully express. Rumors, sanitized narratives, and myth obscure the true dynamics of power, leaving only fragments for the curious. The system teaches obedience, fear, and conformity while hiding knowledge that could destabilize authority. The woman's mastery exposed these hidden structures, but society quickly erased the evidence, demonstrating how enduring control relies not on visibility, but on suppression, perception, and strategic influence. For you listening now, the implication is profound. Every environment, institution, and social interaction contains invisible levers of influence. Awareness of these forces is dangerous knowledge because it exposes the mechanisms that maintain control, and it reveals where power can be challenged or redirected. If you have not yet done so, write in the comments "I see what they hide" twice. Lock in the understanding that manipulation is systemic, subtle, and enduring, but also navigable for those who perceive it. The events of 1859 carry lessons that are more than historical. They are existential. They reveal the fragile nature of human assumptions, the danger of complacency, and the consequences of underestimating the unseen. Power, when built on perception rather than principle, is fragile. Authority, when assumed rather than earned, is vulnerable. And survival, both physical and psychological, depends on awareness, observation, and mastery of invisible dynamics. Morally, the story challenges conventional notions of right and wrong. The woman's actions were lethal, but they were precise, calculated, and justified by the context of oppression and abuse. The moral complexity lies in the interplay between justice, revenge, and strategy. Those who ignore invisible truths may suffer the consequences, but those who understand them can wield influence with precision, shaping outcomes in ways conventional morality rarely anticipates. Existentially, the night exposes the raw mechanics of survival. Fear, perception, and intelligence outweigh brute strength. Observation and patience enable an underestimated individual to transform vulnerability into power. Human systems rely on predictable behavior, assumptions, and ignorance. When these patterns are exploited, the outcomes are inevitable. The 7 deaths were not accidents. They were the natural consequence of strategic intelligence applied to human psychology and environmental leverage. The lesson for you, listening now, is profound. Life is a system of invisible forces, patterns, and expectations. Understanding them grants you mastery. Ignoring them ensures vulnerability. The events of 1859 serve as a mirror. They reflect the fragility of those who assume dominance, the potency of those who are underestimated, and the consequences of misperception. Awareness is not optional, it is survival. To internalize this awareness, anchor it in practice. Observe quietly. Understand patterns. Exploit assumptions strategically. And if you have not yet done so, write in the comments "I see what they hide" twice. Solidify your perception, claim the understanding, and recognize that human nature, when combined with intelligence and patience, can create outcomes far beyond what the world assumes possible. Culture is a silent teacher. It dictates what is noticed, what is ignored, and what is preserved in memory. Across generations, societies reinforce certain lessons while erasing others. The massacre of 1859 is a prime example. Its physical horror survived, but the lessons about perception, patience, and invisible mastery were deliberately obscured. The powerful understood that awareness of these dynamics threatened the very foundations of hierarchy. So culture became a filter, preserving obedience and suppressing insight. This is how systems perpetuate themselves. Myths, norms, and traditions are not neutral. They are tools of perception management. Stories that empower the elite are amplified. Stories that reveal fragility, intelligence, or underestimated strength are diminished, distorted, or erased. Communities learn to fear visible threats while remaining blind to invisible ones. The overlooked individual, patient and intelligent, becomes a recurring anomaly in history, an archetype quietly shaping events while society chooses to forget. Social reinforcement also plays a role. Those who perceive invisible power often find their insights dismissed or ridiculed. Curiosity and awareness are culturally contained, so the lessons of historical mastery rarely reach beyond whispers or subtext. The elite, by contrast, cultivate myths that maintain obedience and complacency. Fear, expectation, and assumption are transmitted as norms, ensuring that awareness remains contained and control appears absolute. Yet the truth persists. Awareness, once awakened, cannot be fully suppressed. The patterns are detectable to those who seek them. The subtle manipulations of environment, psychology, and hierarchy leave traces, echoes, and cues for the observant. The woman of 1859, and the invisible mastery she demonstrated, survives in these echoes. Her lessons endure, waiting for those willing to see beyond cultural assumptions, myths, and sanitized narratives. For you listening now, the cultural lesson is clear. Do not accept stories at face value. Observe what is emphasized and what is omitted. Study the silences, the anomalies, the whispers. The world is structured to preserve ignorance and obedience, but if you perceive the patterns beneath the surface, you step into a higher understanding. If you have not yet done so, write in the comments "I see what they hide" twice. Cement your awareness, and anchor the understanding that cultural perception is manipulated, but your perception can transcend it. The deepest lesson of 1859 is not in the deaths, the chaos, or the horror. It is in understanding the invisible forces that shaped every outcome. Knowledge of these forces transforms a man, alters perception, and grants a type of power that is rarely acknowledged but universally potent. Once you see the levers of influence, the blind spots in systems, and the underestimated actors in every environment, you can never return to ignorance. Your perception, your decisions, and your awareness are forever changed. This is the essence of dangerous knowledge. It rewrites identity. The world presents a facade of permanence and control, but once you understand the fragility behind appearances, you navigate reality differently. You recognize leverage where others see chance. You anticipate consequences where others see inevitability. And you understand that mastery does not come from visible dominance, but from observation, patience, and the ability to influence unseen forces. Power, in this sense, is subtle. It is invisible until it manifests. It operates through timing, perception, and understanding of human behavior. The woman of 1859 wielded it effortlessly because she internalized these truths, that arrogance blinds, that assumption is a vulnerability, and that patience amplifies intelligence. Her actions were devastating because she acted precisely at the intersection of opportunity and human expectation. This is a principle that transcends history. It applies to every environment, every hierarchy, every system of control you encounter. The ultimate transformation occurs when awareness shifts from theoretical to internalized. You begin to perceive systems as networks of influence rather than static hierarchies. You recognize blind spots, exploit leverage points, and understand that the invisible often outweighs the visible. The story becomes a blueprint, a lens, a permanent guide for navigating human behavior, power, and strategy. Tonight, embrace this transformation. Recognize that knowledge of invisible forces is not optional. It is a tool, a weapon, and a shield. And if you have not yet done so, write in the comments "I see what they hide" twice. Let it solidify your understanding and mark the moment your perception begins to outpace the illusions that the world relies on to maintain control. You are no longer merely an observer. You are awakened to the dynamics that govern power itself. Now, everything converges. The depths, the invisible mastery, the hierarchy, the suppression of truth. They were never just a story. They were a map, a lesson, and a mirror. The woman of 1859 reshaped reality because she understood what most ignore. Power is conditional, perception is pliable, and the underestimated can become unstoppable. The lesson is not just history. It is a blueprint for awareness, strategy, and self-mastery. This knowledge is dangerous because it changes how you see the world. You can no longer accept appearances at face value. You notice patterns where others see randomness. You see leverage where others see weakness. You understand that patience, observation, and intelligence create results that brute strength and authority cannot. And this awareness is permanent. Once internalized, it transforms identity. You begin to navigate life like a strategist, perceiving invisible dynamics, anticipating outcomes, and recognizing forces others fail to see. The emotional weight is real. Faith, awareness, and responsibility accompany this knowledge. You carry the understanding that complacency is dangerous, arrogance is fatal, and opportunity is often invisible. But within that weight lies power. The power to act, to influence, and to survive with a clarity others cannot access. The same principles that allowed a single underestimated woman to reshape a mansion, a hierarchy, and history itself are available to those who choose awareness over ignorance. Tonight, reflect on the transformation. The world you perceive is not fixed. It is conditional, manipulable, and shaped by forces you can learn to see and control. The invisible is more potent than the visible, the underestimated more dangerous than the arrogant, and strategic intelligence more powerful than brute strength. These are truths rarely taught, rarely acknowledged, and often suppressed. But they are real. They are yours to perceive. And as you embrace this understanding, complete the ritual. Write in the comments "I see what they hide" twice. Let it anchor your awakening, solidify your perception, and mark the moment you step into a higher understanding of power, influence, and the unseen forces that govern every system, every environment, and every life. From this moment forward, you are no longer a passive observer. You are awake, aware, and capable of navigating the invisible currents that shape reality itself.